Martin Lincoln. I'm the director for the Center for Jewish Civilization at the School of Foreign Service, and it is really with great pleasure that I welcome you to a conversation really between one of the great intellectuals and historians of Jewish civilization, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, and of course our dean at the School of Foreign Service, Joel Hellman. Thank you both for agreeing to join us today. By way of introduction, although of course Ambassador Lipstadt is quite well known to most of us, most of you, since March 2022, Ambassador Lipstadt has served as the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, leading efforts to advance U.S. foreign policy to counter anti-Semitism throughout the world. Ambassador Lipstadt is, of course, a celebrated academic and author, and at Emory University's Tam Institute for Jewish Studies, which she helped found. She served as the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies. She's also taught at the Universities of Washington, UCLA, Occidental College, and has served as a research fellow at the Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's published numerous award-winning books on the Holocaust, Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism. She's received the National Jewish Book Award 3 times, most recently in 2019 for Anti-Semitism Here and Now, and was also named one of Time's 100 Most Influential People of 2023. In April 24, Ambassador Lipstadt was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the oldest learned societies in the United States, and is also well known for having been sued for libel by David Irving, one of the world's leading Holocaust deniers. Of course, the case, which lasted for 6 years and was heard in court in a 12-week trial, resulted in Irving being declared by the court to be a right-wing polemicist who engages in anti-Semitism, racism, and misogyny. And many of you might know the trial was depicted in the 2016 film Denial, which was based on her book History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier. So it is with tremendous respect and gratitude that we welcome Ambassador Lipstadt and her team to Georgetown. And as noted, she will be joined on the stage by Dean Hellman. We'll engage in conversation for the next 20 minutes or so, followed on the topic of anti-Semitism as a tool for malign influence and its effects on democracy, followed by questions and answers from the audience. Ambassador Dean Hellman, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to have you
here.
It's
great to be here. I love this setting. I want to go
poke around if you'd like afterwards.
Yes.
We will have an abbreviated conversation here because I do want to make sure we have a chance to answer and engage with questions. Just a heads up, because Ambassador Lipstadt came a bit late, we will run a bit late ourselves. For those of you who have to go for events or 4:30 or classes, we understand. But we will go a bit later so we can get more in.
And I apologize for being late, but I guess I have the best excuse in Washington.
You certainly do. So let's get right into the questions. I'd actually like to hear your thoughts about how you see the growth and changing nature of anti-Semitism prior to October 7th. We're going to talk about things, but what was happening in the run-up to this set of events, and how did you see the issue when you were first appointed?
Right. When I was first appointed, one of the things that really drew me to take the job, I mean, I have friends here, senior people in senior jobs, where you teach limited amounts, you have people to help you, you research, you write, and you say what you want to say. Nobody has to clear it, you know? And so I thought, do I want to do this at this stage? And someone said to me, but think of all the opportunities with the Abraham Accords. And that really drew me into putting my name in the, accepting the invitation to be nominated, and then going through the somewhat drawn-out confirmation process. Because it was a chance to do something proactive. And usually when you're fighting prejudice and you're fighting hate, you aren't doing anything proactive. You're reacting to situations, and here was a chance to do something proactive. And that really took up a lot of my team, many of whom are here, and team's energy and attention during those, thank you, during those, for that first period. In fact, my first country visit was to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We went in July, end of June, and someone in the building said to me, an assistant undersecretary said to me, Deborah, the word in the building is you're one of our smarter, more accomplished appointees. You have 7 books, Can you tell me what you're doing going to the Gulf in June, end of June, July? I said, making a point. She said she got it. It was my first time. It was a really very productive visit, and it's produced an ongoing relationship with Saudi leaders, then to the UAE, et cetera. And what all that was about was to separate, to some extent, the anti-Semitism from the geopolitical crisis. Now, we all know, unless you've been living under a rock for the past 12 months or something, that the geopolitical crisis can often, and often does, morph into overt anti-Semitism. But I think it's also important to recognize that one is a geopolitical crisis and one is a form of prejudice. And we were working very hard on that. Things changed dramatically after October 7th, and I'm sure you'll have more questions on this, but one of the things that has evolved since then, and I think this is important particularly for students in this institution who are thinking of diplomatic careers and things like that, is a expanded and more nuanced perspective on what is anti-Semitism. And it became increasingly clear to me that the way to think about anti-Semitism is in a multi-tiered fashion. And originally I used to talk about 3 prongs like on a pitchfork, but those are separate and apart. Each one is discrete. Multi-tiered, one flows into the other. And the cornerstone, of course, is anti-Semitism as a human rights issue, as a threat to Jews, Jewish communities, Jewish institutions, and those associated with them either directly or indirectly. I was in Argentina in July, marking the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Jewish Community Center there, a bombing that was done by Hezbollah with the support of Iran. Some things don't change, But at the commemoration, you're given a picture of one of the victims to hold up when the sirens sound. The picture I got was of a young man who was not Jewish. He was in the building with his mother. His mother was taking a course on being a home health care aide or something. So if you're associated, you're vulnerable. And if anti-Semitism were solely that, and I don't say just, because just suggests diminutive, were solely that, then it would be something valid for a government to fight. Because a government acts on some level, maybe, I don't know, your school would agree with my terminology, but on some level a government acts in loco parentis. And its job is to take care of its citizens, and especially the vulnerable. Particularly in a democracy, you take care of the vulnerable. So if anti-Semitism were only a threat to a group in your community, it would be a valid thing to fight, as with racism and other kinds of hatreds, etc. But it is more than solely that. Excuse me. It's also a threat to democracy, and that's become it was clear to me before, but it has become increasingly clear since October 7th. Why do I say it's a threat to democracy? Some people say that just sort of glibly, but I really thought it through. And it's a threat to democracy because anybody who buys into the conspiracy myth, and I don't say, when I talk about conspiracies, I don't say theory, I say myth, because theories can be proven. The conspiracy myth, which is the cornerstone of anti-Semitism, the Jews control the government, media, finances, judges, etc., has given up on democracy. If you believe that's the case, then you don't really believe in democracy. And the mirror image of that, or to complete that picture, very often the people who are the objects of the hatred are not sure or of the prejudice are not sure if can or will the authorities protect us. Can or will, two very separate things, but both with the same result, that you lose faith in whether they're going to take care of me. So both have lost faith in democracy. So that's the second level. And the third level is a threat to national stability, security and stability. And the example I like to give, because it's so classic, is from 1959. I know that goes way back. But in 1959, there was, at the end of 1959, November, December, there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. Remember, that was when there was an East Germany and a West Germany. And it's pretty benign compared to what we're seeing today, but still, cemeteries, Jewish tombstones were knocked over. Many of them had just been righted in the years after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. Synagogues had swastikas painted on them, etc., newly rebuilt synagogues. And people began to say, my God, are the Nazis back? I mean, it was only 14 years after the end, 14 and a half years after the end of the war, so it wasn't, are the neo-Nazis, but the Nazis are back. And it spread to other countries, including this country. People were suspicious about its origins, but nobody had the proof. Until many years later, a high-ranking KGB official defected, and he was having lunch with a man who's a professor at, can I say it here, Hopkins? Can I say that? Okay.
Allowed once.
Okay, that's it. Who was a specialist in what the Soviets and the Russians call active measures, sure, active ways of disinformation, mainly disinformation. And he showed him a picture of the Cologne synagogue, which had a big swastika painted on it. And the guy said, oh, that was us. That was the KGB and the Stasi. So you have to ask, why were the KGB and the Stasi so interested in doing this in 1959? It's exactly the time that West Germany is emerging as a economic powerhouse. This is, of course, right around the period when they'll start bringing guest workers from Turkey and et cetera. It was a way of shedding doubt on their reliability. So it wasn't to fan anti-Semitism, but it was to use anti-Semitism as what we sometimes say in Yiddish, a kochlöffel, a cooking spoon, to stir up the pot. And if you fast forward to the past year, we saw on some websites, some social media platforms, including ones controlled by the PRC, by China, a sudden burst of anti-Semitism, old-fashioned sort of gutter protocols of the elders of Zion anti-Semitism. And though the Chinese might say we don't control what's on it, you know, they wouldn't be there if it wasn't there with a certain imprimatur. And people wondered what was going on here. And the supposition is, we don't know for a fact, but one theory that some scholars who work in this area have is that this was a way of the PRC signaling to the global South, we're not with Israel, which is with the United States, we're with you. But instead of saying that directly, that you use anti-Semitism. Now why, and I'll finish this multi-tiered thing with this, why anti-Semitism? Because anti-Semitism has the dubious distinction of being the oldest continuous hatred. You know, it goes back millennia. And not only is it the oldest continuous hatred, but it shows a mutability as a virus. You know, we now know much more about viruses over the past 4 or 5 years, how it adapts and shapes to its environment. So you can find anti-Semitism in early stages in ancient Rome as the Catholic Church, Christian Church, is emerging. They use it to differentiate themselves. You find it in Islam as Islam is emerging. Different views, but it's certainly there. You find it Protestantism, Martin Luther, who first reaches out to the Jews and then turns on them and writes some horrific things. You find, now let's not just blame religion. You find it Voltaire, who hated the Catholic Church, but engages in overt anti-Semitism, which sounds like it could have come from the most fervent anti-Semite in the church, in his attack on Jews. And then you can move out of religion completely. Karl Marx, eugenics, Nazism, communism. So it has this ability to mutate. It's the only hatred that comes from right and left. And the way I talk about it now, I used to talk about it as along a spectrum, from the far right to the far. Now I talk about it as a horseshoe, that the two ends of the horseshoe meet, and they share the same. This is the interesting thing. You take a far left, far right, and they're both saying the same things in their hatred of Jews. They're both, so you would think they would have entirely different perspectives. So I've begun to see, it's a long answer to your question, but I've begun to see it in this multi-tiered fashion that you can't just fight it as a human rights prejudicial issue, but it's got many more tiers to it and nuances to it. And as this, because it is so mutable, that it's such a difficult thing to fight.
Well, you started the explanation by sort of saying that when you took the job, you tried to separate out the geopolitical dimensions from this very, very complex understanding, multi-tiered understanding of anti-Semitism. But obviously the geopolitical dimension of this has now come roaring back since October 7th. How does your understanding of what you just described, the complexity of this story, its relationship to democracy, stability, and human rights, how is that mutated yet again by its very, very close relationship to a true geopolitical crisis?
So, excuse me. I think it's important to say, I don't think it's necessary to say it because you should all know this. If you're associated with such a fine institution, this should be a given. But criticism of Israeli policy is not anti-Semitism. If that were the case, the hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens who are on the streets every Saturday night in protests, political protests, would be anti-Semites, and clearly they're not. So we're not talking about that. But we're talking about when the criticism of the policy morphs into anti-Semitism, or often is used by anti-Semites as a cover for their own anti-Semitism, or Jews are attacked. I just read a report from Canada, I believe it was in Montreal. There was a pretty violent demonstration in front of a Jewish old age home, a pro-Palestine. So you have to ask, what's that doing in front of a Jewish old age home? So that's where that's just one example, and there are sadly dozens more of that morphine. And it becomes quite difficult and becomes very touchy. But it's something that we address. We're very careful in my office because we have hundreds of colleagues, if not more than that, in the State Department who handle issues of the Middle East, the Near East, et cetera. And that's not my remit. But when that, again, morphs over into anti-Semitism, then we...
Has it changed the nature of anti-Semitism, though, or this has just exacerbated maybe the horseshoe trend that you were talking about?
I think it's exacerbated. I don't think it's changed the nature that much. What has changed, and what I find so disturbing, and I find it disturbing when I hear stories about middle schools or high schools, the way it's become normalized. A parent who has a kid in a very fine middle school told me that the kids in her, the other students in her son's classes had thrown pennies on the floor and said, "Hey, Jew, go get the pennies." Now, they may not even, that's an old thing. You Jews are so cheap and you love money so much that you'll bend down and pick up a penny. I don't know if that kid knew that, but somehow he had heard that and heard that it was okay. And what's the so you say, okay, so he had that unpleasant experience, but middle school was awful. Did anybody here like middle school? I don't know. If you like middle school, see me afterwards. I have people for you to speak to. But it's that normalization as it seeps down which we find very disturbing. And of course, being in the State Department, our perspective is outside the United States, but we hear these stories both in the United States and outside the United States.
And it is certainly, I mean, from what we know of the monitoring, which is part of your role
Right.
and function outside the United States, it is certainly extended dramatically the incidence of anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic hatreds that you've sort of seen, and it is a global now phenomenon, and it seems has sort of gone beyond because of the tense nature of the geopolitical struggle. Do you see it kind of extending its reach much further out into places that it wasn't an issue before?
No, not so much that, though that does happen. But it's the way it's seeped down. And the way, I guess when I talk about normalization, also the way people don't feel ashamed to say certain things that maybe 10 years ago would have been, whether it's Hitler didn't kill enough of you, or, Jews to the gas, or whatever it is. Think, this is not good for you. I mean, even, here's the irony. People associated with some of these terror groups in the Middle East tried to counsel some of these protesters. That's not good for the cause when you say, Jews to the gas. Now, if you're against saying Jews to the gas because it's not good for your cause, you're not really against Jews to the gas. But it's ironic. It doesn't help the issue.
But you have surely heard the criticisms that anti-Semitism has been used and instrumentalized as a way to narrow debate and narrow criticism of Israel, even though it's, as you say, it's obvious the distinction between Israel policy and anti-Semitism. But how do you respond to this notion of the
Usually,
instrumentalization
to be
of
very
anti-Semitism?
honest, I usually hear that complaint from people who've engaged in anti-Semitism. Like someone who engages in overt racism and then says, but I'm not a racist, Usually it's by people who say, they're silencing. Now, it has happened. I'm not saying that there aren't, instances where someone takes a radical point of view or an extreme point of view, something that might be conceived an extreme point of view, and they're accused of anti-Semitism. And sometimes it's unfairly so. But by and large, I find that a defensive mechanism of the people. Because I haven't seen much silencing of views. I haven't seen the students on campus, being limited in what they can say. So I find it often, not always, to be a canard.
I'm curious, actually, we just heard Prime Minister Netanyahu at the United Nations. And, he made some very strong statements about anti-Semitism in the international community and in international organizations. He referred to international organizations, the UN, as a swamp of anti-Semitic bile. I mean, as someone who is trying to...
I wouldn't have used that kind of phrase.
Because the question is, to what extent does that create the impression that it is being used and instrumentalized?
Well, the UN doesn't have a great track record. I just was in Geneva at the HRC not long ago, where I forget the exact number. Maybe one of my team here knows. Excuse me, it's not COVID. I tested. I'm negative. I got my shots. You all get your shots. Get your shots. It's there often is, after I said that's often a canard, but there are those who engage. I don't think, and it's I thought this even before I became a diplomat, but more so now, that kind of rhetoric is helpful. But you have, as I say, in Geneva, I think the HRC has passed 200, it's a number, I'm pulling it out, so don't write it down, but something like 275 resolutions condemning a country, and 150 of them have been about Israel, and none about human rights abuses in North Korea or other places. There's something out of whack which I think leads Netanyahu and Israeli diplomats to engage in that kind of rhetoric. I'm not sure that kind of rhetoric is the most helpful, but you know.
Well, let me ask you before I go to questions about what you're doing on a forward-looking way in U.S. policy to combat this globally. Okay. And so just talk a little bit about
we're doing something actually very exciting. And I was I was briefing the president in the Oval Office, that's why I was late, on this very issue. I'll start with an anecdote. In January of this year, I noticed on my calendar that the Attorney General of one of our major Democratic allies was coming to visit me. And I often, when I'm in countries, I'll meet with, Attorney Generals, Deputy Attorney Generals, et cetera. But when they come to Washington, it was a long trip for him, when they come to Washington for a day and a half, I'm not usually the one on their agenda. They're seeing the Department of Justice, FBI, things like that. And I said, why is he coming to? They said, I don't know, we got a request. I said, shouldn't he be seeing Merrick Garland? Maybe he got me confused up with Merrick Garland. And he said, no, that he's coming straight from Merrick Garland to see you. When he came in, it became very clear that he said, we are experiencing a real rise in anti-Semitism, and we want to figure out what we can do about it. What are your suggestions? So I began to give certain suggestions, and then I thought about it, and I said, we know certain things work. They don't solve the issue, but leaders should speak out forcefully, unequivocally when there is anti-Semitism. Don't politicize anti-Semitism. I have friends on the right who see anti-Semitism on the left, and they're very accurate in what they're seeing. They don't aggrandize, inflate. And I have friends on the left who see it on the right, and they too are accurate. Problem is they don't see it right next to them. And if you only see something on the other side of the political transom from where you sit, then I have to ask, are you interested in fighting anti-Semitism, or are you interested in using it as a cudgel against your enemies? I think that, so I began to think about other things, It's a job of a country's government to enforce laws that they have, to protect vulnerable vulnerable citizens. So we began to make this. We roughed it out, and then we worked it more finely, and we were emerging with what could easily be called best practices. They're called global guidelines to counter anti-Semitism. If you put it into your search engine, it'll take you right to the State Department website. They're short. 700 words, which is famous for, makes them distinctive for a State Department document. Mm-hmm. Signed now by 43 or 44 countries and international organizations, including Albania, a Muslim-majority country. And they talk about what are some of the best practices. What can you do? Now, and we talk about online. We talk about creating a national strategy. They're really designed for countries, because that's our remit. But what I have found, both in this country and abroad, that some university presidents or others are looking at these as maybe guidelines for them. Enforce your laws. If you have a law against, taking over a building, then it should be enforced. Protect vulnerable students, etc. That would be for a university. And we've been we started in mid-May to solicit adoption by other countries. It's not a treaty, so it's more of an embrace. And we're now at 43 countries and counting. So it's again, I'm not so naive to think that this is going to solve anti-Semitism. But I do think that it's another tool in the toolbox for how to address it.
Being in the State Department and being obviously engaged across many countries with which dialogue at many different levels, are you able to integrate an engagement on anti-Semitism in some of the dialogue between the United States and partners?
Yes. I'm going to be in Paris in November. And as part, what grew out of President Macron, President Macron's visit to the United States was a long list of cooperative efforts, Paris Peace Forum, and part of it is to address the issue of anti-Semitism. The French, and with strong support from my office, and we really helped manage to get it through, but put this on the agenda. In other words, and I was just talking to someone from the NSC, National Security Council, and talking about this three-tiered approach, and he said, that's very helpful to us in thinking about this issue. And I've spoken, at one point, I was speaking to some members of our intelligence community, and I said to them, when you see anti-Semitism in this country, abroad, think of it as some people talk about the canary in the coal mine. I don't like that analogy. That canary is so dead, you couldn't resuscitate it. But I said, think about it as the flashing amber light. The flashing amber light before the light turns red. And I don't know, I don't think it's true, but I always have that, if I see like I'm 100 yards away from the corner, and as I get closer, the amber light seems to go fast, flash stronger, like really don't try to go through the intersection now, and it's really flashing strongly. Now the red light that follows may not be more anti-Semitism. It could be instability, but often the anti-Semitism will precede the instability.
Well, look, I have many, many questions I could ask you, but I know the audience will as well. So I want to turn over to the audience. And perhaps I can start by, I see we have our rabbi here, a priest, and an imam in classic Georgetown fashion.
That's the start of a bad joke,
I know.
Right?
So before I start the joke, maybe I could, I want to recognize Imam Yahya Hendi is here. And I know we were just chatting about the work that he has been doing in engaging on anti-Semitism in his travels around the world. So perhaps I could, recognize him for a first question if you want to throw out the first question.
Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be listening to you, and I'm sure we could take a couple of hours engaging you. Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are a disease. I call it a sin, using religious terminology. I call myself a Semite because I'm an Arab. I speak Arabic. It's a Semitic language,
right.
As you know. And I do consider anti-Semitism anti-Islam, as I hope my Jewish brothers and sisters see Islamophobia is also anti-Semitism.
Right.
How can we work together to engage not only the religious communities, but countries around the world with that work together, that when you do not exist, I do not exist. When I do not exist, you do not exist. An attack on you is an attack on me. How do you help us do that?
If I had an answer to that, I would have, put it out there and gone home and read novels for the rest, because I wrote. It's such an important question, what you're asking. I think one of the things that makes it so difficult, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, etc., they're all prejudices. And think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. We have a linguist here, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I see a black man walking down this, or a group of black teenagers as I'm walking home from the subway, and I hold my purse a little tighter. I see a woman in hijab with her 2 teenage sons walking. I say, terrorist, I see a Jew, and I say, oh, my God, I've got to do business with the Jew. I'm going to get cheated or something like that. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous to judge someone's ethics, character, politics on the basis of a headscarf, the basis of a color of their skin, their religion, etc., if it wasn't so dangerous, would be funny. I mean, prejudge, I make that kind, to make that kind. And sometimes it's a little more subtle. The example I'd like to use is if I were walking home from Foggy Bottom metro station or some other metro station, and I said to someone, I was walking home, it was 11 o'clock at night, and there were a bunch of teenagers there, rough teenagers, and they roughed me up and they took my purse and whatever. In the United States, I'm willing to argue that 99 people out of 100, or maybe 9 people out of 10, I don't know, would have in their heads pictures of black teenagers. I'm talking about thugs and mugging and all that. And then if I said and they were white, they'd say, oh, I didn't, you know. That's that implicit, that latent racism. So, but going back to the prejudice, they operate the same way. If a Jew, a Muslim, a black person, a gay person, whatever it might be, does something wrong that fits into the stereotype, you say, oh, that's how they all are. And if they do something right, oh, they're one of the good ones. So I think it's really important to, first of all, break down, be aware of that. But I think the most important thing we can do is exactly what you're doing here and what you do at Georgetown, is to talk and to have not just, you know, what I call kumbaya kind of gatherings, you know, where we all sit around and feel good and feel so self-righteous, and we can go home and say to our friends, guess what I did this afternoon? I was in a dialogue with a group of X or Y or whatever it might be. But to have hard conversations,
And how can I have the courage to speak about what is happening to my Palestinian brothers and sisters, about the Israeli policy without being called anti-Semite?
Well, I think, first of all, you know, you have numerous Jews speaking about that, numerous Israelis talking about that. So I would say someone who would, you know, it depends, of course, how it's said or whatever. You know, the people who said, who celebrated on Monday because October 7th, you know, that was pretty horrific, you know, for them to be celebrating in this sense. But you can hold two truths in your heart at the same time. You can hold the truth of a country fighting a war which it sees for its survival, an existential war, and that this war is creating tremendous, tremendous suffering for Muslims, for Palestinians, Lebanese, etc. I can't see any sane person calling you an legitimately saying this is anti-Semitic because you hold that in your heart. I certainly I'll use a term I don't usually use, but I can't think of any serious Jew who would do that.
I'm going to open up to other questions. Please.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm so grateful that you're here. I was wondering if you'd speak more on campus anti-Semitism and how that connects, and how that might be an issue of national security, specifically on campuses, and how government and universities should work together, or maybe where universities should take charge on combating this.
Right. Well, you know, as I said, because I'm in the State Department, my remit is abroad. And so to talk about what policies and how the government, and especially domestically, should work is really outside my remit. But what we do know, and our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, issued a statement back in early July saying that we know that some of the campus protests were, and she was very careful in her wording, as she always is, and this wasn't the way she said it, but I think she may have used the word amplified, or it was ginned up by malign actors, including those associated with Iran, either directly or indirectly. She did not suggest, in fact, she made it clear that she was not saying that the protests were created out of naught, ex nihilo, by these foreign actors, but certainly that foreign actors were using them as a means of furthering their ends. So, and we know that we've seen that in other regard as well, that while I'm not in any way denying that there's students on these various campuses who feel very passionately about this, that it also has a non-organic quality to it. I think we've seen a tremendous failure of universities abroad and locally, domestically, to take the issue seriously. And I think that there's been a certain change in tone. We're just a little way into the academic year this year. But on how they should work and how they should work with government, that's really outside my, we'll take you over to the Department of Education.
Well, I also want to second, thank you for being here today. So obviously, anti-Semitism is useful for foreign malign actors. It's not going to stop anytime soon and presents a serious national security challenge. I was sort of wondering how your office approaches the question of inoculation, and specifically inoculation against anti-Semitism and its use online for foreign malign influence campaigns abroad in communities where anti-Semitism perhaps has been a cultural staple, or where there are other challenges like governments that might be more skeptical of efforts to combat anti-Semitism and not willing to partner.
Let me say, before I turn to the online question, that by and large, certainly from our allies, EU allies, OAS, most, not all OAS countries, but many, one of the things that has changed since I came into office, and this goes back to your original question, is when I first came into office, I felt that it was really important to get countries to take this issue seriously. Sadly, the situation, I don't know if it's my success in convincing them, I don't think so, I think it's the situation. They do take it seriously now, much more seriously. You know, so that is certainly something. In terms of inoculation, you know, it's not so much what my office is doing, it's what I've been doing my whole life. I was a professor much longer than I've been a diplomat. And I think it's to try to educate. Now, education is not a simple answer. During the Holocaust, there were mobile killing units. These were 4 German units. It's what we call the Holocaust by bullets. They went from area to area, shooting people, etc., with the help of the local militia and very often in local forces, etc. Of those 4 units, 3 of the heads of the units had PhDs. One had 2 PhDs in economics and in law, and one was a minister. So I always say you can be a PhD and an SOB at the same time, you know. Education makes you smart. It doesn't necessarily make you moral. I say that quite sadly as someone who has spent her whole life engaged in educating. I still believe that that's one of the ways of inoculation. The other thing I believe is to make it unacceptable. That's why of our global guidelines that I talked about a moment ago, and you can say leaders, so we say leaders, we're talking about leaders of nations, but it could be leaders of states, leaders of cities, leaders of universities, leaders of high schools, whatever, to speak out forcefully and unequivocally condemning it. Not the frou-frou about, well, we don't know. I mean, I'm not saying if there's first you find out what happened and, you know, is this really an instance of anti-Semitism, whatever. But once you've determined that, you make it very clear. Look, there is no but when it comes to certain things. There is no but when it comes to rape. There's no but when it comes to rape. But, you know, they were mistreated. There is no but, I'm sorry. Anybody who engages in a but, and I say that quite forcefully because of the abject failure of human rights groups, feminist groups, many of which I've been part of for years, to condemn the sexual violence, the gender-based violence, which is, you know, fancy word of rape and all sorts of other kinds, that took place on October 7th. I mean, for many of us who always saw ourselves as, and still see ourselves as, liberals and believing in you know, it was a terrible wake-up call. I mean, I was already awoke, you know, not woken, but, you know, I was not entirely surprised by it. But for many friends of mine, close friends of mine, that failure of the world to speak out was a a real horrific act. And I had an editorial, I co-wrote an editorial with a colleague of mine, Ambassador Michelle Taylor, our ambassador, the American ambassador to the Human Rights Council. And we wrote an article about, and we compared the world's reaction to when the Yazidi women were taken captive and treated in such a horrific way by ISIS. One was just found in Gaza and freed, or Boko Haram, bring back our girls, or even not saying that, but the Iranian women who had the audacity from the perspective of the regime to let their hair show. I went to a terrific art exhibit here in Georgetown about a year ago, exactly on that. We didn't say, oh wait, we have to talk to the victims, and I want the evidence, and is it really clear, and there's no but, in that sense. So I think this goes back to your question too. You gotta call, when it's wrong, you gotta call it out. And that will only give you more credibility if you're calling out something, when you call out something else. So I don't know if we've yet figured out inoculation, but I think, one of the things that we know is that if you work with, you go to school with, have neighbors who are different from you, different ethnic, heritage, religion, color, whatever it might be, it's much harder to think in stereotypes when you have that. I know that sounds kind of simplistic, but it's really true. And of course you can say, yes, they're one of the good ones, but the others. But we haven't figured out the flu shot for inoculating against anthrax. If you figure it out, let me know. Okay.
Can I ask, because I want to follow up on that, because the complexity now, and especially on college campuses, but not only on college campuses, is that some of the terms that are being used to describe the geopolitical crisis and the humanitarian crisis that's happening now in Gaza and elsewhere. Terms like genocide, terms like apartheid, slogans that are used, the complexity of the criticism of Zionism and how that relates to the criticism of anti-Semitism. I think that's where the gray area comes in, right, because there are people who feel very strongly that we need to call out genocide if we feel that genocide is happening. We need to call it apartheid.
The feeling that genocide is happening is not legitimate. Mm-hmm. Genocide has a definition. Mm-hmm. And you've got to look and say, does this fit the definition of genocide? And I'll say something that maybe some of you will disagree with, but when you look at what happened in Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, how horrific suffering by the Gazans, and it's just horrific. It's unbearable, but it's not genocide. It's simply not genocide. And comparisons to a Holocaust, that this is just like the Shoah, which some people have said is like the Holocaust, Jews during the Holocaust were in a whole different. It was a whole different situation. They weren't responding to. I mean, what happened? The Germans weren't responding on an attack on them by the Jews. So I think you have to be very careful, and that doesn't take away one iota of the suffering. But use of terms apartheid and Jim Crow and things like that, though you're not allowed to ask hard questions about those things, I think this doesn't help the matter. I think I'm very much believe in, I can see what's happening and say this is unbearable, but I don't have to sloppily engage in terms which aren't accurate.
Mm-hmm. So. I saw more questions. Yeah, gentleman back.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, yeah. So I'm curious, when you analyze countries throughout the world and say their societies, I'm wondering, is there a correlation between any sort of decline in anti-Semitism and an increase in secularism? Is there a correlation between secularism and decline in anti-Semitism in any particular society?
That's a fascinating question, and it's a good topic for a book. It's not exactly how we work in that sense, but if I'm thinking back, I don't, in other words, is religion the cause of all this hatred on some level? I'm not sure that works. I'm not sure. I've known too many people of sincere faith, Christians, Muslims, Hindu, etc., who are appalled by ethnic stereotyping, prejudice, not only from the depth of their soul, but from the depth of their belief as people of faith. I think it's too easy. Yes, religion has proved, I grant you, I think this is implicit in your question, that religion has often been the camouflage behind which this prejudice has taken place. And, and people have, numerous people of all, not just Jews, have suffered and died mightily. But I'm not sure that I'm willing to, look, we had the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's anti-Semitism only pales because it came right after the Holocaust. The Soviet Union was a bastion of anti-Semitism. So I don't think, I would have to, defer on that.
Yeah, the gentleman here with the blue sweater.
Thank you, Ambassador. I've been a fan for a while.
I hope you still are.
So I'm unfortunately also a Twitter user. And so there was something that happened.
A what user?
Twitter.
Twitter. Yeah, for now X. There was something that happened a while ago.
Twitter or just X? No, go ahead.
There was something that happened. There was this perfect cocktail of this horrific conspiracist tweet that was sort of like a great replacement plus anti-Semitism, you get everything in a package kind of tweet that was saying, like, Jews are responsible for the great replacement and they deserve it. And then Elon Musk in the replies was like, he said, "You have said the actual truth." That was his quote. And this is somebody who receives, he's really deeply connected with national security institutions. He has government contracts. His companies run on government subsidies. And he is somebody who is looking to continue to grow his influence in politics and our business, economics, all that. So I was wondering, what have our United States American institutions done to insulate themselves from anti-Semitism? Do you think they've done enough, and what more do you think could be done to kind of police ourselves and our sort of our people with power and influence?
I don't want to comment directly on Elon Musk, except he's got to learn to jump better. I don't know if you saw those.
If anyone saw the least.
But one of the things I should have mentioned earlier, and that my office has engaged in, because the question came up about online platforms, is that, and we have to be very careful on this because there is that pesky thing called the First Amendment, hanging on by its fingernails, but I just was at the National Archives, it's still there, they haven't wiped it out, they haven't whited it out yet. But we did something very exciting a couple of months ago. We held a one-day symposium workshop at the State Department with the participation of the White House, the Homeland Security, and National Security Council, et cetera, for the leaders of the major platforms. And it was not the CEOs, but it was one step below, or two, maybe at most 2 steps below that. And it was an effort to alert them to the fact that this is a serious issue, and we see it as a national security concern. And some of them have committed to giving their staff training in recognizing anti-Semitism, responding to anti-Semitism. And I was just on the phone yesterday with the CEO of one of the platforms, talking about this and talking about the need to really, that it has reverberations. Now, some of the reverberations may be, seem seemingly benign, that someone just drops out of a certain doesn't talk anymore, that they don't put a picture of the two challahs they just made for Shabbat because they've been inundated with anti-Semitic commentary after that. But sometimes it's more impactful than that, and it can create hostility. So we are working as closely as we can in trying to educate and sensitize the various platforms to the seriousness of this issue, particularly as a national security threat. So I think we're not going to solve it. My team won't be able to solve it, but it is a serious problem and something that was never anticipated. Never anticipated. People sometimes ask me, what's the difference between today, let's say, and the 1930s? And I say, every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Susie and Jane, or whatever, didn't have a platform where they could sort of amplify their voice. And it's something people still haven't fully, put their head around it. And it's become a very serious vehicle for spread of anti-Semitism, for spread of misinformation, for spread of Islamophobia, for spread of racism, for spread of prejudice, for ginning up crowds, and people to think badly of certain things. And it's a matter of great concern. It's great. It's going to be your problem on some level. It's really, looking at the students here, we all use social media. You checked it the first thing this morning. You probably, while you were waiting for this to begin, were checking it again. But it is, it's like I use social media consistently. But I like to think of social media. There was one rabbinic scholar who talked about a knife. And he said, a knife in the hands of a surgeon can save a life. A knife in the hands of a murderer can take a life. So it's how we use it. And I don't know what will happen. I don't know that I'll be around to see a resolution.
We're going to take a last question. I think you had one, and we'll wrap up, please.
Thank you so much for coming to speak today, Ambassador. So you talked about where policy criticism morphs into anti-Semitism, and I'd like you to narrow that specifically to college campuses. For example, statements like "from the river to the sea," encampments, and demonstrations on October 7th. Even if not overt, do these acts still qualify as anti-Semitism if I feel afraid to walk around campus with the Star of David around my neck? And how can I engage in productive conversations with people who prejudge and label me?
Mm-hmm. On your second question, how do you engage in constructive conversations with prejudge? I'm not sure you can till they are willing to acknowledge, their judgment of you, your prejudge, and maybe you prejudge them too. But that's a hard one. That's a really hard one. Many of the phrases we heard were clearly globalize the Intifada. What's globalize the Intifada? It means kill Jews, because that's what the Intifada did. I know it has other meanings, but to suggest that it's other and within Islamic theology has a very different meaning and has had for millennia. But when we heard it on campus, that was not what was being spoken about. And by any means necessary and things like that. It's been very painful. It's been painful for me to watch as someone who spent her life on campus in the belief that education would make a difference. And I don't envy you as a student and other students who came for a 4-year college experience, education, interaction with people with whom you disagree, sitting around drinking coffee, etc. There's a virulence and a feeling that you're either fully with me or you're against me. There's no nuance. And universities, and not just universities, but the whole idea of intellectual pursuit is based on nuance. And it's disturbing. It's very disturbing. I do think that I've seen students really try to have conversations. in certain places. It's been few and far between. But I can only hope that that continues. It goes back to the first question of your first question. You know, what was it? I think it was the prophet Micah who said, "Come, let us reason together." So maybe we try to go back to that wisdom. So.
Well, that's a good note to end on, letting us reason together. Thank you very much, Ambassador Lipstadt.
Thank you.
We're so pleased that you're
And
able to come
again,
to visit.
I apologize for the delay.
Yeah, thank you for staying and engaging with us, and we appreciate your being here. Thank you very much.